Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a pretty wild journey. We're going to trace the hidden architecture of how our modern world was built, and we're starting way back in the chaotic, swashbuckling days of 17th century pirate commonwealths and bringing it all the way up to the rigid, highly bureaucratic geopolitical data of the present day. If you've ever stopped to wonder why the world is divided by such strict borders, or why only governments are allowed to have armies, well, the answer is a lot wilder than you might think. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this incredibly provocative quote. It is honestly crazy to think about, but this was actually said by a pirate captain operating out of Madagascar. I am a free prince. I mean, that completely shatters our modern assumption of what a state actually is, right? Or who has the right to wage war. Hundreds of years ago, a guy with a ship and a crew felt he had the exact same legal and moral authority to wage a war as a legitimate king with a massive army. So to understand why that pirate felt so emboldened, we have to talk about sovereignty. Today, we define sovereignty as a state's claim to ultimate authority and its absolute monopoly on legitimate violence. If violence happens today, either the state is the one doing it or the state is punishing it. But this total overarching control we're all used to, it was actually a very late, incredibly hard-won development in human history. For centuries, the state didn't have a monopoly on violence at all.
Section 1. When states shared power.
So, in our first historical era, violence was actually democratized and marketized. Early modern states simply didn't have the cash or the resources to maintain huge standing armies. The old feudal systems were just too restrictive. So, what did they do? To build their empires and fight their wars, rulers effectively outsourced their military expansion. They voluntarily shared power with non-state actors. In the 1300s, you see the rise of mercenary free companies. By the 1600s, states are chartering massive mercantile companies. And then by the 1700s, we hit the absolute peak of state-sponsored privateers, which were essentially legalized pirates. To put this into perspective, just look at the data on standing armies at the time. Check out Prussia. Over 50% of their army was made up of foreigners. France sat at around 20%. Great Britain heavily relied on renting troops from German states like Hesse-Kassel. This clearly demonstrates that military service back then was treated purely as a market commodity. It was entirely detached from nationality. If you had the money, you could literally just go out and buy an army from the international system. And, it wasn't just mercenaries. It was corporations, too. States literally delegated their own sovereign powers to megacorporations, like the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. And these weren't just trading firms. Look at the powers granted to them. They were empowered to raise private armies, build fortresses, make war, independently negotiate international treaties, and even mint their own money. The state intentionally created these institutions to bypass the constraints of feudalism, so they could expand globally on a budget. But here is what brilliantly illustrates the real motivation behind all this: plausible deniability. This is a concept state rulers essentially invented around the 17th century. They authorized all this private violence because they wanted to claim a share of the profits if a venture succeeded. But if a privateer or a mercantile company caused a massive international incident, the ruler could just shrug and legally deny responsibility. They just say, hey, that was a private operation, nothing to do with us. They absolutely loved this system because it blurred the lines between politics and economics, and it brought in massive wealth without the diplomatic baggage. Section 2. The unintended consequences. But as you might expect, letting heavily armed, profit-driven non-state actors roam the globe didn't exactly go smoothly. In fact, absolute chaos ensued. Those privateers the states authorized? Well, they evolved into massive, highly organized pirate commonwealths that just targeted anyone with wealth. Mercenaries started going completely rogue. Take the Grand Catalan Company. This was a force of 6,500 men who turned on their employer and established their own duchy of mercenaries that lasted for 63 years. No joke. And even worse, the mercantile companies began fighting each other, and sometimes actively used military violence against their own home states just to defend their private property. They completely ignored the official wars or peace times of Europe. Which brings us to a massive historical dilemma. I really want you to think about this question for a second. If non-state violence emanates from territory where no recognized ruler claims sovereignty, who is ultimately responsible? European rulers suddenly realized their plausible deniability had become a total nightmare. They could no longer disclaim responsibility for violence that originated from their shores without looking incredibly weak, or worse, inviting constant, unregulated war. Section 3. Monopolizing global violence. This brings us to the climax of our historical arc. This is the moment where states collectively decide they absolutely must disarm everyone else if they want to survive. The elimination of non-state violence happened in three main steps. First, delegitimation. Through intense interstate pressure, states started framing mercenaries and privateers as international problems. Second, legislation. Throughout the 19th century, states passed laws that actually revoked a person's citizenship if they went and fought for a foreign army. And finally, abolition. Formal international treaties finally ended privateering and stripped corporations of their sovereign powers. And the crazy thing? The public wasn't asking for this. It was strictly state rulers realizing they needed to hold each other accountable.
So, the crucial point is summarized perfectly in this quote. The shift to modern sovereignty wasn't just about the state claiming total power. It was equally about the state being forced to accept total responsibility for anything that happened in its territory. You can't have a monopoly on power unless you also take a monopoly on the blame. Violence was effectively territorialized.
Section 4. Modern sovereignty and borders.
So, because states spent centuries territorializing their power to stop all those rogue mercenaries and pirates, our modern national identities became incredibly rigid inside those borders. To see how extreme this us versus them mentality has become today, just look at the US and Canada. Despite sharing one of the longest, most peaceful borders in the world, recent polling data shows a massive, unprecedented gap in how these two neighbors view each other right now. Americans hold an 80% favorable view of Canada. But the Canadian view of the US, it has plummeted to just 33% favorability. When we look at the driving forces behind this gap, surveys point to trade friction, aggressive tariff implementations, and polarizing political rhetoric. The data shows this animosity isn't just cultural teasing anymore. It's shifted to genuine economic and security concerns. In fact, polling indicates that 69% of Canadians currently view the US as a potential threat requiring caution. It really goes to show just how deeply modern borders shape our psychology, dividing the world strictly into us and them. Section 5. The State and Mortality.
Now let's look at an even more intimate side of state power. Because the modern state doesn't just control borders, it administratively defines life and death. For example, look at this recent data from Health Canada's 6th annual report regarding the top causes of death. Medical assistance in dying, or MAID, now accounts for 5.1% of all deaths nationwide. That is roughly 1 in every 20 deaths. If counted as its own category, it sits firmly in the top 5, trailing only major categories like cancer, heart disease, accidents, and respiratory illnesses.
But here is where the absolute authority of the state to classify reality really comes into focus. Under the official rules, the ones used by Statistics Canada and the World Health Organization, death is officially coded to the underlying medical condition. Since 63% of MAID recipients have terminal cancer, their official cause of death is recorded as cancer. Then you have the government's perspective. They view MAID strictly as an end-of-life health service meant to ease suffering. Conversely, you have the critics' view. Human rights groups and others argue it should be classified distinctly because it is an active medical intervention. This fierce institutional debate really highlights how the modern state's authority to classify, record, and define data sparks intense social divides.
Which leaves us with this. We started in a world where governments literally shared the power to wage war with pirates, mercenaries, and corporations, simply because they couldn't do it themselves. Today, the state's monopolization of power is so absolute that it rigidly controls international borders, shapes national psyches, and administratively defines the data surrounding our final days on Earth. So, how far has state authority truly evolved? And as our world continues to change, what on earth will it encompass next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helps you see the hidden architecture of our world just a little bit clearer.